I was
How
on the
big was the commission?
7-member commission. By law, not more than 4 can be of one political party. Now, some governors have stretched that so that they don't appoint, we'll say, the opposition. They appoint someone who at least is not another out-and-out member of their party.
Right.
So I served for 22 years on the commission, 18 and a half as chairperson. Again, the tradition had been that the chairman is a member of the governor's party. Well, when Jennifer Granholm was elected governor, I kind of figured my days as chairman, at least, were numbered. But we didn't make any change until my term came up about 3 years later. And Governor Granholm called me and she said, I'm happy to reappoint you as a member, because Frank Kelly was already on the commission, and Frank was a great booster of hers and of me to her. Right. So I was always pretty sure I'd get reappointed. But she said, however, I would like to have a member of my party as the chairman.
Yeah.
And so she said, how about if Frank becomes chairman? Sure. So that worked out. I was vice chairman for that 3.5-year period. And then when her governorship ended, and we had a new governor in 2011. Yeah,
2011.
Yeah, I immediately became chairman
again for another 2 years.
Yes, and Frank became vice chairman.
And he became vice chairman. Well, okay, Mackinac Island is a special place. There are some very arcane lease and tax arrangements up there that are peculiar to Mackinac Island. What are some of the things that you encountered? For instance, I mean, this seems really minor, but wasn't there some controversy over selling the captain's quarters up there next to Fort Michilimackinac? I mean, what?
Oh, every once in a while, it's like clockwork, and we're overdue for it now, so it should be happening one of these days soon. And someone will say, to raise money for the state, let's just sell the governor's residence, or we'll sell the captain's quarters and the major's quarters. So then we have to remind them that the state of Michigan acquired these properties from the federal government in 1895, but with a reverter clause, which says if these are not used for public purposes, these properties revert to the federal government. So then we have to tell them, no, you can't do that unless you want the soul to revert to the federal government. So there were some cries for selling the governor's residence and the captains and majors. But one of the first big controversies when I became member and chair was over the leasing of the land on which these big West Bluff and East Bluff homes, cottages.
Mansions.
Sit.
Yeah.
Individuals own the residences, the buildings, but they do not own the land under it. That land is leased from the State Park Commission. Now that first started when the federal government owned that property. So it wasn't an invention of the State Park Commission. The State Park Commission in 1895, when it succeeded the federal government, sort of inherited that system. But the issue was, what is a fair rent to charge for that land? And in the Depression, and people forget this, in the Depression, a number of the residences up there went into tax delinquency. You could have bought almost any place on the bluffs for $800, $1,000, $1,500.
Unbelievable.
And the argument at the time with the State Park Commission was, well, we've got to lower these rents so that people can continue to own these houses if possible. So the rents were lowered down to, in many cases, $50 and $25 a year. Well, the Depression ended. We went into the good times of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, but the rent never changed. And I always thought that was wrong, and I determined, after being notified that I would be on the commission, that one of my first objectives would be to make the whole rent system more fair, because it's the taxpayers who are losing the revenue. Well, coincidentally, the Detroit Free Press, at about the time after I was appointed,
in the early 90s.
Yeah, the early 90s, went on a rampage over the scandal of these low lease rates. And I was sympathetic to it, although they kind of overplayed their hand. But on the other hand, the incumbent cottage owners wanted no part of raising these rates. So what I did was to diffuse it, was to appoint a commission, the old political
Right.
standby
Right.
ploy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we appointed good people to the commission.
Wasn't Kelly on it?
No, Phil Runkle, the outgoing state
Okay.
superintendent of public, he had been state
Yeah.
superintendent of public instruction. I made him chairman because he owned property on the island, so he wasn't just picked off the wall.
Right.
And a highly respected local circuit judge, Edward Fenlon, who used to be a rum runner between Mackinac Island and the Snow Islands long before he was a judge in the Prohibition days.
Yeah.
And we appointed a historian, a real estate expert, appointed this blue ribbon committee. They came back with recommendations that we adopted, and they are in place to this day. And they have a CPI in them, so they stay fresh. And so we cleaned that system up completely. And another big issue always was the funding, the proper funding of the state park, because we needed adequate money to run and preserve Mackinac.
Right. Right. Well, also, didn't Governor Granholm at some point in her tenure zero out Mackinac Island, saying you're getting no money this year, we've got a fiscal crisis? What happened then?
Yes, she did, and she took some very bad advice from her director of the DNR, whose name at the moment, fortunately, escapes me. She said the director of the DNR recommended to the governor that we get zero general fund monies and that there be an admission fee basically charged. There'd be a head tax. You come to Mackinac Island, you pay whatever. I don't know, was it going to be $5? I don't know what it was.
I mean, tourists come over on the ferry and they have to pay head tax.
And we pointed out that, number one, the ferries don't land in the state park. Therefore, we don't even know how you can collect this because they land in the city of Mackinac Island. And the park boundaries are very irregular. They're not what you might think, by the way. But the bottom line is that when you come to Mackinac Island, you don't land in the state park. You land in the city. You soon get into the state park. But unless you had gates all over, you could never collect that tax. So once again, we appointed a citizens committee to make recommendations, which quickly came back and said, this head tax is a bad idea, won't fly. And we came up with some other things, but eventually the governor wisely saw that this was not a good approach, and she very wisely, to her credit, dropped the idea, and to this day we do not have a head tax for entering Mackinac Island.
Okay, let's get to Proposal A, which actually happened earlier than what we just talked about, back in 1994. Famous vote, Proposal A, to completely changed the funding mechanism for K-12 public education in Michigan, but it had big ramifications for Mackinac Island. And how did you negotiate a solution to that crisis?
In terms of dollar and cents benefit to Mackinac Island, that probably was one of my greatest accomplishments. Proposal A, as you've indicated, was a very drastic proposal at the time and had the effect of greatly reducing property taxes in Michigan, except in the case of Mackinac Island, where, because of high property tax values, we had a very low school millage. So to adopt the Proposal A formula, whereby it was 18 mills flat and then, I guess 18 mills flat, we would have had to have doubled our school tax. Well, I discovered that Senator Harry Gast was
who was from Southwest Michigan, and he had a little community called Bridgman.
Correct.
Which I think was the only other community in the entire state with a situation like Mackinac Island for other reasons. So you got together with your old buddy Harry Gast because you served with him in the House.
We've got to solve this problem for our two communities, and so we did. We wrote into the law that under certain circumstances, your old millage is your base millage, and consequently, instead of paying 18 mills for schools, we only pay like 9 mills, and the net result for our business community and for second homeowners was a huge relief. And so, that was a very important thing.
Yeah, I mean, you saved millions of dollars to
correct.
These businesses and
the second homes. And of course, the first homes, the local population, they were covered they were okay anyway because they had homesteads, and so homesteads were taxed at a lower level. But it was the second homes and the businesses that would have gotten a huge leap. And by the way, one of the reasons that we never want Mackinac Island schools, even though they only now have 75 students, we do not want a merger with anybody else. Because if we have a merger with, for example, St. Ignace, we would inherit their property tax structure.
Right.
And would result in a big jump in
Right.
taxes. So we do not want any mergers.